Hello everyone, my name is Fajar Krisnanta Ginting. I want to explain my study journal about theory of addiction and Tafin user explanation for continuing drug use and relapse. Introduction. Many theories of addiction have been proposed to identify the mechanism that best explain the behaviors observed in addicts. These theories frequently rely on preclinical data, primarily because they permit research into the underlying neural mechanism in ways not possible using human subjects. The theories addressed here include negative reinforcement in R or pain avoidance. Number 2, positive reinforcement or PR or the pleasure seeking. Number 3, incentive salience or IS or craving. Number 4, stimulus response learning or SRL or habits. And last, in the inhibitory control dysfunction or IIC or impulsivity. The names used for these models are descriptive and are not necessarily those originally proposed by the authors. The names of the quotation are colloquial. This list is not exhaustive but serves to outline broad areas of active research. Other theories have been suggested but haven't yet gained wide acceptance. Negative reinforcement provide one of the earliest theoretical explanations of addictive behavior. The basic premise is that drugs used to reduce withdrawal dysphoria. A more recent and sophisticated example of this model highlights the cumulative negative effects produced by repeat cycles of intoxication and withdrawal, and falls under the rubric of the opponent process theory of emotional regulation. Positive reinforcement based on classical learning theory is probably the most familiar preclinical model of addiction. Quite simply, this theory states that users will say they take drugs but they enjoy using them. The incentive salience model posits links between the sensitization of particular brain system and motivation, which is distilled into the concept of drug craving. In this theory, the attribution of intensive salience to drug-related stimuli is increased by exposure to abused drugs. Hence, according to the incentive salience theory, drug used to attributable to craving. The stimulus response learning model identifies habit learning as the key to understanding addiction in clinical theory, and the outcome determines the like. In the classical theory, stimuli and response are associated with outcomes, and the outcomes determines the likelihood that the response will follow the stimulus in the future. In the stimulus response learning, the outcome is less important, and the stimulus itself elicits a habitual response. Conditional reinforcement and impulsivity are key features of this theory. This model predicts that users will describe drug taking as habitual or compulsive. The inhibitory control dysfunction model implicates impulsivity as the factor that underlies addiction. Impulsivity had been linked to adaptive approach system as well drugs-related impairment in new learning and preservation. Thus, model involving inhibitory control deficit products that users will be attribute drug use to impulsivity of or preservation. Preclinical research on these theories examines behavior or naturally activity underlying behavior. By contrast, clinical research often involves of the survey of participants to understand the motivations that underlie their behavior. While it is true that clinical studies often lack the experimental control that is typically observed in preclinical studies, clinical studies are not solely reliant on inference to determine the motivation of the study participants. Methamphetamine abuse can potentially be explained by the aforementioned preclinical models of addiction, namely methamphetamine produce typically stimulant effects in many users, including self-report, euphoria, and withdrawal. Methamphetamine exposure also increases self-report craving in some users, and craving for methamphetamine is associated with withdrawal methamphetamine use in clinical trials. Methamphetamine users are also exhibit deficit in response inhibition, suggesting that deficit in inhibitory control may play a role in methamphetamine use as well. Although the role of stimulus response learning in methamphetamine use has not been investigated clinically, there is a large preclinical literature suggesting stimulus response learning plays a role. To investigate user perception of the reason for their methamphetamine use, we are constructed a survey in which participants self-perceive reason for taking methamphetamine or for relapsing to methamphetamine use were assessed on a 7-point scale for each of the 5 domains mentioned above. This survey was intended to sample the opinions of the methamphetamine volunteers regarding the reason for their using drugs. We hypothesize that methamphetamine-dependent volunteers will be comprised of subgroups that vary in terms of identifying the best explanation for their methamphetamine use. Now we in the page of methods. First is the participant. The participant included the 73 non-treatment seeking methamphetamine dependent men and women. Subjects were recruited from the community via radio and newspaper advertisement. All participants met this DSM-4 criteria for the methamphetamine dependence and didn't meet criteria for the other current axis 1 psychiatric disorder or depends on other drugs aside from nicotine. The study procedures and informed consent documents were approved by the Institutional Review Board of the University of California, Los Angeles. After the rest of the study had been fully explained, all subjects provided informed consent were paid for the participation upon completion of the study. The subject demographics are detailed in Table 1. Number 2, about procedure or our measures. The participants completed an initial battery of the questionnaires, including demographic, locator, and requirement surveys. Subjects were administered a variety of assessments, including the SCID on the structured clinical interview for DSM-4 TR diagnosis, or MINI, addiction severity index slide, back depression inventory, and a timeline follow back to assess drug use in the prior six weeks. At the time of assessment, a toxicology screen was performed to assess recent substance use. Participants then complete the main instrument, a questionnaire assessing self-perceived reason for taking drugs or for relapsing. The questionnaire used a 7-point scale and included questions addressing each of the 5 domains described above. The scale ranged from 1 or not at all to 7 very much. The specific questions are shown in Table 2. The third of now is data analysis. The mean and standard deviation for each question in the questionnaire were calculated. The internal consistency of the questionnaire was assessed using a cron-batch alpha. This calculation was performed including all questions shown in Table 2. The participants' response to each question were then analyzed using chi-square statistics. Responses were recorded into 3 categories. 1 until 2 is not at all, 3 until 5 is somewhat, 6 until 7 is very much, to simplify the data analysis. The frequency at which participants selected each category across all questions was calculated, and this frequency was used as the expected frequency for each question. The frequency at which participants selected each category for each question was then used as a observed frequency. The chi-square test was used to determine whether each category was selected at the frequencies that were greater or lesser than the expected for each question. The significance was set at p less than 0.05. Percent correlations were used to relate depression severity indexed by the Beck Depression Inventory with response to the question is, do you use drugs mostly to make bad feelings go away? Next, we are conducted a correlation factor analysis to limit the number of variables. We will include only the first question in each category as being representative. See in Table 2, the variable exploitation was used. Now we are in the page results. Table 1 shows demographic and drug use data for participants completing the study. Participants reported using methamphetamine 13.6 plus 8.7 days out of the past of 30 days. As typical for studies of methamphetamine Japan participants, most were male 84% and Caucasian 45%. None of the participants met the criteria for abuse or depends on cocaine. Not surprisingly, participants rated economic problems and drugs problems highly on the ASI. Further analysis wasn't conducted because ASI scores were available for only a subset of the participants and equal 51. Test items were internally consistent. The cron-batch alpha equally 898 based on the response from X69 individuals with complete data for all questions shows in Table 2. Table 2 also shows the lowest 1 or 2 or not at all, and the highest 6 or 7 is very much. Ratings by the participants for each question on the questionnaire. Most respondents, 56%, report that they used drugs due to positive reinforcement, and similar proportion, 44%, identified that they relapsed for the same reason. However, 56% of respondents reporting that they used drugs due to positive reinforcement, comprising 52% of the total sample, also respond very much to the question is, do you have many things besides drugs This suggests that reinforce other than methamphetamine remain effective for most participants. The next highest category rated highly were impaired inhibitory control 27% and negative reinforcement 23%, and similar numbers reported and then they relapse for this reason as well. Among these, identifying negative reinforcement as an important motivation, only 7 of 17 or 51% responded that they frequently use drugs due to withdrawal symptoms. Somewhat smaller numbers responded that stimulus response learning, 25%, or incentive salience, 19%, were very important for ongoing drugs use or relapse. Of the 56% of the participants who rated positive reinforcement as a highly important motivation for using methamphetamine, only 8 of these, 6 or 11% of the total, also rated negative reinforcement highly. So these two categories were mostly no overlapping. 40 of the 16 subjects who rated stimulus response learning highly also rated positive reinforcement as a motivation for use. Similarly, of 12 of 20 subjects who rated impaired inhibitory control highly also rated positively reinforcement highly. By contrast, only 8 of 14 participants who rated incentive silence highly also rated positive reinforcement highly, whereas 15 of 15 ratings incentive salience highly also rated negative reinforcement. Examination of response patterns suggests participants were consistent in their answer. Most are 15 of 18 individuals who rated the stimulus response learning as a very important motivation for using the methamphetamine. Of the question of do you find yourself getting ready to take drugs without thinking about it? Also report the methamphetamine use seems like a habit, like a nailing, biting, or picks. 20 participants rated impaired inhibitory control as a very important motivation for using drugs. Of these, 14 rated highly is the ones you began to get ready to use. Do you find you can stop? 16 of these 20 also rated positive reinforcement highly as a motivation for using drugs. The smaller number of the participants, or 14 or 19.2%, rated the incentive silence highly as a reason for using drugs. Of these, 8 also rated positive reinforcement highly, where the 5 rated negative reinforcement highly as an explanation for their behavior. By contrast, an even larger number, 35 or 47%, reported that the objects paired with the drug use, such as pipe or razors, didn't produce cravings. The correlation matrix for results from the first question from each category is shown in Table 3. The factor analysis result in the emergence of the two factors accounting for 60.3% of the variance in Figure 1. One factor corresponds basically to the negative reinforcement, and the other factor corresponded basically to positive reinforcement. Responded to the remaining question correlated with each of these to varying degrees. Very similar results were obtained using an rotated matrix not shown. When the factor analysis was run with the negative reinforcement question excluded, only one component could be extracted, and it accounted for 55% of the variance are not shown. Next, we examined the relationship between response to key question and mood. To do this, we examined the correlation between ratings on the first question in each category and the BDI score. Significant correlation were observed 4 more questions. Negative reinforcement R equal 307, P equal P less than 0.01, incentive salience R equal to 397 or P less than 0.001. Stimulus response learning R equally 384 or P less than 0.001, and impaired inhibitory control R equally 318 and P less than 0.01, all correlated with scores on the BDI. Only rating on the positive reinforcement scale didn't correlate with the score on the BDI. R equal 100 and S or no ES. We also explore the relationship between response to key question, demographic, and drugs use data. The addiction severity response to non-key question correlated with age they used in the past month or year of use responded on the negative reinforcement, correlated significantly with economic complication R equal negative 32 or P less than 0.05, alcohol complication R equally negative 30 and P less than 0.05, and the drug complication R equally 30 and P less than 0.05. No other correlation were significant. Now we in the phase of discussion. Greatest number of the participants rated positive reinforcement or the pleasure-seeking as a very important motivation for their drug use, with a smaller but generally non-overlapping group reporting pain avoidance or negative reinforcement as a very important motivation for drug use. Many of those identifying positive reinforcement as important also rated stimulus response learning, incentive salience, or inhibitory control dysfunction as important, suggesting that the obvious motivation of pleasure-seeking frequently coexists with other, perhaps equally relevant, reasons for using drugs. This overlap has been emphasized previously in the theoretical papers on addiction, but to our knowledge, has not been tested in the clinical models of addiction. Surprisingly, however, participants rating positive reinforcement as very important to their drugs use also that they continue to enjoy other activities as well. Rating on this scale didn't correlate with depressive symptom either. This is at odds with the idea that chronic drugs exposure produces dysfunction in the brain reward system, rendering users less able to enjoy other activities. True, we cannot directly test the hypothesis in this study. Among these rating negative reinforcement highly, less than half also report that drugs lessen withdrawal symptoms. This was unexpected, as this aspect of negative reinforcement seems critical for theories of addiction based on opponent process concept. According to negative reinforcement theory, drug use is motivated by withdrawal symptoms that are reversed by drugs used early in addictive process, but later they are only partially transiently reversed by drug use. A minority of our participants rate a negative reinforcement or withdrawal as important to their ongoing drug use. This was expected as a methamphetamine has a long elimination half-life, produce marked change in the brain dopamine, and has been reported to produce withdrawal symptoms. The stimulus response learning model has rated highly by a substantial subgroup of participants. This group described their drug use as habitual and thoughtless. This is consistent with the theories of aberrant learning, which reports that drug-seeking behavior progress from an action outcome stage in which reinforcing effects control behavior to a habit stage in which stimulus response associations take over control. Addiction is conceived in the part as a habitual responding that is relatively incentive to the value of the reward. One-fifth or 20% of our participants identified drug taking as having prominent habitual characteristic. Impairment in inhibitory control, or more broadly impulsivity, is another conceptualization of the addiction with a strong basis in neuroscience research. About a quarter of our participation reported that impaired inhibitory controls plays a role in ongoing drug use and relapse. Impulsivity is a multi-dimensional construct including such concepts as perseveration, acting in the absence of the forethought, and undue risk-taking. Further work is needed to characterize the aspects of impulsivity that participants believe are most important. Incentive silence or craving as rate highly as a motivation for drug use and relapse by the smallest of the participants. A finding at odds with a common conceptualization of addiction. Strikingly, 36% believe that craving contribute not at all to their drug use, and the majority, 55%, didn't believe that objects associated with drugs use produce cravings. Explanation for this contradictory finding could including the suggestion that participants have a response bias against reporting craving, that they are unaware of cravings, or that they divine craving idiosyncratically and do not attribute the relevant feeling to the word craving. Clinical experience suggests that some subjects, for example, identify craving with the specific somatic experience and would use the words desire or wants to express what we refer to as craving. If this were so, the participants might have rated this item differently if we had used the word want rather than crave. On the other hand, in the modest magnitude of the Q-induced increase in the craving seen in the experimental studies as generally not support appreciated. For example, in a large study in this area, about one-third of 150 cocaine-dependent volunteers didn't report any increase in craving following exposure to cocaine use. In another study, 45 of those reporting increase in craving of the magnitude of increase average 30.4 points out of 10.45. This frequency and magnitude of craving may not be sufficient to account for a great deal of drug use. This is consistent with a recent qualitative study that found that most the methamphetamine users did not perceive craving as insurmountable. By the contrast, in clinical trials, craving has been shown to significantly predict subsequent drug use, suggesting that there may well to be an important role for craving as an important motivation for drug use. This issue requires further investigation. The result from the correlation and factor analysis suggests that the positive and negative reinforcement reflect different constructs, with the other construct being related somewhat to each. This suggests that concepts associated with the other theories of addiction are needed for a comprehensive understanding of participant perceived motivation for using methamphetamines. Depressive symptoms indexed by the BDI were positively associated with ratings for the first question in each category except positive reinforcement, which didn't correlate with the BDI. This suggests that depressive symptoms may contribute to the negative reinforcing and incentive effects of drugs and may play a role in impulsive drug use. This also suggests that people reporting they use drugs for the pleasure effect do so irrespective of self-report depressive symptoms. Result from this study supports the contention that methamphetamine user may be more heterogeneous than is often appreciated, and imply that the treatment development might be more successful if aimed at a particular subtypes of the patients. A formidable challenge is identifying valid subgroups of users. Further research is needed to define coherent subgroups of users that could guide the development of individualized treatment for the methamphetamines depends. In addition, it is unclear whether subgroups, if they could be identified reliably, would be stable over time. Nevertheless, results from this study indicate that use identify a range of motivation for using drugs, suggesting that further research in this area would likely contribute to advance in treatment development. In the absence of external validation, as a key limitation of this survey approach is that we sampled participation opinions regarding reason for using methamphetamines and didn't employ questionnaires with established reliability and validity, although the instrument had been substantial internal consistency as evidenced by the high cron batch alpha level. This report must serve as a preliminary evidence of the usefulness of this novel instrument. The potential pitfalls of self-report instruments are well known. A further limitation of these findings include the underrepresentation of the women and minority racial and ethnic groups amongst the methamphetamine users in the West Los Angeles, the area where the survey was conducted. Nevertheless, this initial attempt to characterize response of the self-identified subgroups of the methamphetamines dependent volunteers may inform treatment development researchers by facilitating the identification of the more homogeneous subgroups of patients. This may facilitate the identification of treatments with differing degrees of efficacy for different subgroups of patients. Thank you for everyone already watched my reference journal studies. I hope the journal studies will help you for we go away from the drugs use. And thank you for Ma'am Wisma Yunita already give me a chance to do my presentation. And see you next time. Goodbye. Bye bye.